Detective Sarah Chun exited her unmarked vehicle as the morning mist hung heavy over the Catskill Mountains, her breath creating tiny clouds in the cool October air. She was finishing her second cup of coffee at the precinct when the call came in at 6:47 that morning. Something that would disturb the peace of this woodland in upstate New York and bring back a mystery that had plagued Manhattan's financial sector for almost 50 years was discovered during a routine dig for a new hiking trail. As Chun got closer to the crime scene tape that now surrounded a piece of deep forest close to the settlement of Phoenicia, she drew her jacket tighter against the fall chill. Overhead, a lovely canopy was formed by the orange and yellow leaves. However, beneath them was something much darker than anyone could have predicted when the construction team started working 3 days prior. Tommy Rodriguez, a weathered man who operated the excavator, stood anxiously smoking next to his equipment, clearly horrified by W. I've been operating heavy machinery for 23 years, so I was just doing my job, and I've never seen anything like this. Chun could see the real anguish in his dark brown eyes, and his accent had hints of Puerto Rican ancestry. At first, I reasoned that it might just be some old trash, or as I mentioned, a septic tank. However, as soon as I saw that curvature and contour, I realized it was something completely different. With an almost spectral appearance, the Rolls-Royce silver shadow rose from its grave. Beneath layers of rust, filth, and the collected debris of 50 seasons, the formerly immaculate British racing green paint was now hardly noticeable. Every surface was covered in mud, which filled up the spaces between the wire spoke wheels that had once shone with flawless chrome and covered up the well-known spirit of ecstasy hood ornament. Despite the deterioration over time, the luxury sedan's graceful lines remained identifiable, and the patient embrace of the earth. Chin-skilled, I observed every detail as she circled the car. This was not an accidental burial, as evidenced by the carefully packed and stacked soil surrounding the car. The vehicle's resting depth of about 6 feet below the present ground level S. The air was heavy with the metallic smell of rust, the diesel fumes from Rodriguez's excavator, and the stench of wet ground and rotting leaves. She could hear the sound of a hawk circling overhead and the soft babble of a creek in the distance. This was not your typical abandoned car. This could have been the solution to one of the longest-running missing person cases in New York City. Chun had the well-known rush of excitement that accompanies a significant break in a cold case, but it was tempered by the sobering knowledge that they were probably dealing with a murder that had gone unreported for 50 years. For New York City, 1975 had been a turbulent year. The local government was on the verge of going bankrupt. The city's boroughs saw an epidemic-like rise in crime rates. Additionally, the wealthy and privileged cocoon that the city's elite inhabited looked to be getting weaker every day. The disappearance of well-known banker Harrison Blackwood had drawn the attention of law enforcement, and, in addition to his enormous riches, he inherited a tradition of financial power dating back to the Gilded Era, when robber barons established their empires on the wealth of steel, oil, and railroads. The Blackwood name was engraved on bronze plaques in some of Manhattan's most prominent buildings, carved onto marble facades, and featured on the boards of significant enterprises, cultural organizations, and charitable foundations throughout the Northeast. Blackwood & Associates, their family bank, was headquartered in a magnificent limestone structure that had been built in 1897 at the height of American wealth, and occupied a coveted address at the intersection of Wall Street and William Street. With enormous Corinthian columns supporting a pediment adorned with allegorical figures symbolizing business, industry, and finance, the building's neoclassical architecture spoke of permanence and stability. Some of America's most significant financial choices were made every day at the banking floors, which had tall ceilings, Italian marble flooring, and crystal chandeliers that threw warm light over mahogany workstations. The bank handled hundreds of millions of dollars worth of portfolios for a variety of clientele, from wealthy New York families who had made their fortunes in manufacturing and shipping to young business people who had created empires in cutting-edge sectors like electronics, plastics, and aerospace technology. Steel magnates from Pittsburgh, oil barons from Texas, entertainment moguls from Hollywood, and tech innovators from the burgeoning Silicon Valley region of California were all on Blackwood's client list, which read like a who's who of American business. Harrison was regarded Degela's art gallery openings and society weddings. He was always immaculately dressed in custom-tailored suits from Savile Row. Pictures of Harrison dancing with debutantes, conversing with senators, or studying paintings at museum exhibitions were frequently featured on the society pages of the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and Vogue. His sincere, yet mysterious smile suggested depths that the camera was never able to fully convey. Harrison Blackwood, however, was much more than a wealthy and attractive person. He had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Business School, where he had distinguished himself not only academically, but also as a thoughtful leader who could bridge different perspectives and find common ground among competing interests, as some cynical observers occasionally suggested in private conversations. His instructors recalled him as a pupil who posed insightful queries and provided creative answers to challenging business issues that had baffled earlier courses. Harrison spent a significant amount of time modernizing his family's banking operations during the E2E decade that followed his graduation. He introduced new financial instruments and technologies that put Blackwood and Associates at the forefront of the quickly evolving world of international finance. Under his direction, the bank established correspondent agreements with financial institutions in major commercial hubs ranging from Tokyo and Hong Kong to London and Frankfurt, and it expanded into new markets throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Harrison was well known in the financial industry for his keen intellect, his extraordinary talent for building connections with influential clients from all over the world, and his remarkable ability to read market trends and predict economic shifts before other analysts could. Fluent in 4 languages, he had traveled widely throughout Europe, Asia, and South America, establishing personal connections with government representatives, company executives, and financial specialists who may offer insights into new market prospects. Harrison was described by those who knew him best as charming but mysterious, with a complexity that distinguished him from many of his friends in Manhattan's financial elite. He could be the life of the party 1 minute, entertaining guests with clever observations about literature and art or amusing tales about his travels, and the next he would withdraw into contemplative solitude, withdrawing to his study to read or just work through difficult issues that occupied his analyti mouthies, and other influential intellectuals whose theories had influenced modern economic theory were kept in his personal library in his rooftop apartment. He frequently took small groups of friends or business acquaintances on day trips that blended leisure with in-depth discussions about business, politics, and culture. He loved sailing his 42-foot yacht down the Connecticut coast on summer weekends. Most intriguingly, Harrison was known to go on what he dubbed thinking expeditions to far-flung parts of the world, disappearing for weeks at a time. He was able to escape the demands of business and social commitments by traveling alone to locations like the Scottish Highlands, the Swiss Alps, secluded communities in South America, and remote islands in the Caribbean. His friends and associates had become used to his sometimes erratic conduct, which they attributed to the demands of handling enormous wealth and responsibility at such a young age. Harrison resided in an opulent penthouse apartment on the up-season hung on the walls. The hardwood floors were covered in Persian and Turkish Oriental rugs, and the rooms were furnished with antique furniture from different eras to create cozy conversation areas. Harrison frequently hosted small dinner parties for prominent people from the fields of banking, politics, and culture in the apartment, which had windows with stunning views of Central Park. Harrison's closest friends and family noticed a rising restlessness in him in the months preceding his disappearance, despite his affluence and high social standing. Investigators were later informed by his longtime secretary, Margaret O'Sullivan, a sharp-eyed Irish-American who had worked for the Blackwood family for more than 15 years, that Harrison had been increasingly preoccupied and worried about something he refused to talk about, even with her. Margaret took great satisfaction in her ability to anticipate Harrison's demands and handle his intricate schedule of social responsibilities, professional engagements, and personal appointments. She had developed an almost maternal protective sense toward him. Margaret observed that Harrison had made a number of enigmatic phone calls from his office in the weeks prior to his disappearance, chatting softly and shutting his door when she came with papers or messages. This conduct was extremely rare for Harrison, who always carried out his business in full transparency and frequently requested Margaret should take notes during crucial discussions. She had discovered him peeking out of his office several times, window at the busy lower Manhattan streets, immersed in contemplation and seeming. Even when she called his name or knocked on his door, he didn't realize she was there. Harrison's sexual life has also generated a lot of conjecture throughout the weeks prior to his disappearance. He had been seeing Victoria Peton, a socialite, lovely brunette from a similarly well-known Boston family, for almost 2 years. Victoria possessed intelligence, accomplished, attractive, and holding degrees from Columbia and Wellesley College, journalism school at the university. She was a freelance writer for a number of prestigious publications, spanning happenings in the arts and culture for magazines such as Town and Harper's Bazaar. Nation, newspaper social sections had consistently covered their connection, and periodicals in the Northeast, with many onlookers anticipating an engagement announcement at any time during the approaching holiday season. Harrison and Victoria seemed to have identical backgrounds, education, hobbies, and social status. But friends of both observed that the couple had appeared tense in previous public appearances, with Harrison appearing aloof and distracted, even when speaking with Victoria in private at social gatherings. Later, Victoria informed police officers that Harrison had becoming more aloof and reticent in their last weeks together, frequently calling off scheduled meals or last-minute weekend excursions with ambiguous justifications for pressing business issues that needed his immediate focus. When she pressed him for specifics of what was, Harrison would dismiss her worries and shift the topic, occasionally acting in an uncomfortably agitated when she continued to ask questions. The Silver Shadow Rolls-Royce that is currently Harrison's pride and delight was buried in the Catskill woodland, a mechanical marvel that flawlessly represented his refined taste and admiration for fine craftsmanship. Early in 1974, he bought the car brand new. It was one of only a few hundred imported to the United States that year as a result of stringent pollution control laws and currency exchange rates that made American consumers find British luxury cars to be very costly. The vehicle stood for the handcrafted interior represents the ultimate in British automotive luxury and engineering brilliance, of deep tan Connolly leather with burled walnut wood trim that had been expertly chosen and matched by skilled artisans in the Rolls-Royce plant in Crewe, England. The interior had been flawlessly polished on every surface, featuring lamb's wool carpeting, chrome-plated controls, and chairs that could be modified to offer the best level of comfort when driving long distances. Harrison placed a special order for his silver shade in British racing green, a hue that was ideal for his old money and refined taste sensibilities, while also demonstrating his admiration for the history of automobiles. Custom. The paint was hand-polished after being applied in several coats. Reflective finish that appeared to be illuminated from within. The vehicle's unique grille with its recognizable spirit of ecstasy hood and vertical chrome slats. Ornament informed anyone who knew about its illustrious past. Automotive superiority. The car was now just as much a part of Harrison's identity as his Anderson and Shepard custom-tailored clothes and his. His graduation year was inscribed on his Harvard class ring and degree. He was often spotted driving through the crowded streets of Manhattan. Everywhere he went, the Rolls-Royce's graceful lines and unique appearance drew attention. The presence of the vehicle had developed into a sort of brand, a representation of the Blackwood at significant business and social gatherings. Family's long-lasting success and impact on American culture. Harrison maintained the Rolls-Royce with great care, having it repaired on a regular basis by experts who understood the British automobile engineering's complexity. The vehicle was stored in a climate-controlled storage under his apartment complex that was shielded from the damaging impacts of the severe New York weather. of road salt applied in the winter. He personally oversaw its cleaning and detailing, frequently working with the garage attendant on Saturday mornings to make sure that every surface shone with immaculate perfection. Early on October 15th, 1975, as he did every workday, Harrison Blackwood departed his penthouse apartment, wearing a charcoal gray suit that is long time. Sevilla Row Taylor, with his family heirloom leather briefcase in hand, that his grandfather had owned. The typical collection of financial paperwork was in the briefcase. Letters and legal documents that made up the day-to-day operations of running a large bank. However, it also contained records that would subsequently be essential to comprehending the circumstances of his vanishing. James Patterson, the building's doorman. Having known Harrison since he was a young man, just out of business school, and had known him for more than 10 years, welcomed him with As Harrison went out into the cool fall air, they exchanged their customary greetings. Patterson informed investigators later that he had not observed anything out of the ordinary about Harrison's behavior that morning, but he did. I remember thinking that Harrison was a little more somber than normal, without his typical grin and quick, discussing current affairs or the weather. The Maple. Fifth Avenue's trees had started to spectacularly change into vivid hues of red, gold, and orange, providing a lovely setting for what seemed to be the beginning of another typical day in the life of a wealthy Manhattanite. The aroma of fallen leaves filled the morning air, as did the far-off scent of pastries and coffee from the little cafes that catered to the wealthy inhabitants of the area. The traffic flowed, as usual in Manhattan, beat a symphony of diesel engines, automobile horns, and a sporadic wail of emergency vehicles' sirens as they navigated the congested streets of the city. Harrison's daily schedule was as exact and systematic as the Swiss timepieces he collected, a practice that demonstrated his self-control and his admiration for mechanical excellence. He would walk the 6 every morning, streets from his residence to the Wall Street offices of Blackwood and Associates, following the same path along Fifth Avenue, travel past Central Park, and then turn east toward the District of Finance. He used this stroll as a transitional period between his private life and his work obligations, enabling him to mentally get ready for the day's difficulties while savoring fleeting moments of isolation amid the city's vibrant energy. Harrison would pause his morning stroll at the same. An elderly Italian immigrant named Joep Martinelli runs a news shop, who had arrived in the United States following World War II and had established a modest but successful company that sells tobacco goods, newspapers, and periodicals to the daily commuters in the area. Having worked with Harrison for many years, Joe Zeep was aware that his documents needed to be prepared by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, at precisely 8:15, and occasionally the London Times when Harrison was keeping up with specific advances in international business. Yeppy took satisfaction in himself on his capacity to recall each frequent customer's preferences and to have quick but insightful discussions on sports, current affairs, or family issues. He became genuinely fond of Harrison, whom he considered to be one of the few affluent clients who cared for him with sincere decency and respect, as opposed to the patronizing apathy that described numerous encounters with Manhattan's elite. Joseph that morning subsequently said investigators that Harrison didn't seem like the calm, self-assured person he usually was. While Harrison was consistently kind and friendly, and he typically exuded a feeling of direction and purpose that resulted from being born to lead and having dedicated his entire life to training for roles of accountability and power. However, on October 15th, Yeppy saw that Harrison's normally self-assured manner seemed tense and a little forced. His usual grin appeared to be forced rather than organic, and he made a small mistake when calculating the precise change for his newspapers, something the exacting banker never did in a typical situation. Yeppy had seen thousands of patrons over time, and had acquired an innate capacity to discern people's emotional states and moods. Harrison's He was concerned about the behavior that morning, but he was unable to comprehend the catastrophic importance of what he was observing. Harrison's first appointment of the day was set for 9 o'clock with a possible new customer, a group of European investors with an interest in U.S. real estate. Efforts and chances for foreign exchange trading. Margaret O'Sullivan had compiled a number of files, preparing the conference, such as background information on the underlying ideas, cost estimates for possible investments, as well as the legal paperwork needed for overseas financial connections. As Harrison repeatedly went over the materials in his office, Margaret noted that he appeared abnormally anxious. He kept checking his watch and repeatedly questioned her on information that he would have easily committed to memory. She saw him repeatedly checking his calendar of appointments, even though punctuality was seldom a worry for him because his standing in society and reputation guaranteed that instead of the other way around, clients always waited for him. As he turned, his hands were a little shaky. She saw a faint sheen of sweat on the pages of the financial papers. On his forehead, even though his air-conditioned workspace was at a pleasant temperature. The team meeting with the European investors went well beyond its 10:30 start time, and into the wee hours of the morning. Margaret heard vibrant sounds coming from behind the locked door of Harrison's office, despite the thick carpet and hefty oak structure preventing her from recognizing particular phrases or comprehending the topic of conversation. The conversation's tone appeared to alternate between friendly business conversation and what sounded like a heated argument. She believed she heard Harrison's voice increase at one point, seeming worried or frustrated, but such, for the typically calm and diplomatic, emotional outbursts were quite uncommon. Banker Harrison took great satisfaction in upholding his professional integrity even amid the most difficult negotiations, and his capacity to maintain composure under duress was one of his most valuable abilities in the intricate field of global finance. When the customers eventually left at 11:45, Margaret saw that they were less content than the usual guests to Harrison's workspace. The principal investor, a well-known Swiss man named Klaus Bear, trembled, looking very serious and a little irritated. Harrison's hand at the entrance. Weber has 2 associates with him, both European businessmen with impeccable attire, who displayed professional courtesy that hardly masked what seemed to be serious dissatisfaction with their meeting's conclusion. As he led the company to the elevator, Harrison's customary charm and self-assurance appeared to be considerably dimmed. And when he came back to talk about the afternoon schedule, Margaret mentally reminded herself to ask him about the meeting. She had worked with Harrison long enough to identify instances in which business conversations had not gone as planned. Expectations and everyone's body language indicated that significant conflicts had arisen when they were speaking. However, Harrison did not show up for work that day as planned. Rather, he paused at Margaret's desk with a look she had never seen before, a mix of resolve and almost hidden fear that instantly set out her protective parental instincts. He told her that he had a pressing personal matter to attend to that could not wait, speaking in crisp, clipped tones that indicated a great deal of tension in spite of his efforts to keep up his typical professional manner. Harrison told Margaret to cancel all of his appointments for the day, including the crucial one she knew. 3 o'clock meeting with the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Board of Trustees to discuss a significant donation. The Blackwood family was thinking about it. When she inquired about rescheduling the museum rendezvous, Harrison appeared to briefly perplexed, as though he had completely forgotten about the crucial appointment. This oversight was totally out of character for someone whose attention to detail and mental discipline were renowned in his industry. Colleagues. As Harrison collected a number of folders from his desk, Margaret became increasingly concerned. He collected what looked to be personal documents from his office and carefully placed them in his leather briefcase. Secure. His meticulous but somewhat rushed actions suggested that whatever situation had arisen needed to be addressed right away. She proposed to speak with his driver or assist him in making travel plans, but Harrison gave a small, non-eye-catching smile and declined. At around 12:15 that afternoon, Harrison walked quickly out of the Blackwood and Associates offices. He drove the Rolls-Royce Silver through Lower Manhattan's winding streets to the parking garage. Shadow. Numerous witnesses, such as a hot dog vendor and the garage attendant on the street corner, subsequently attested to witnessing him pick up his recognizable green luxury vehicle and head north. Through the crowded streets of the financial area in the direction of the Brooklyn Bridge and the roads that led out of the city, Carlos Rivera, a young Puerto Rican man who works as a garage attendant. Harrison was exceptionally impatient while he waited for his car to be delivered, so I could clearly recall the exchange. Raised from the parking level below ground, Harrison would usually strike up a casual discussion about family or news from a neighborhood while you wait. However, he stood quietly that day, making sure. His watch many times, looking around the street as though he was worried about being watched or followed. The final. A toll booth operator on the George Washington Bridge reported seeing Harrison Blackwood when Harrison paid the toll to cross from around 1:45 that afternoon, moving northeast toward Interstate 87 from Manhattan into New Jersey, which would finally lead him to the Catskill Mountain region and the Hudson Valley, where his body would be found half a century later. The woman who operated the toll booth had keen eyes. Called Dorothy Chun, the immigrant grandmother of Detective Sarah Chun, from Taiwan in the 1950s, and had spent 15 years working in the same booth in order to maintain her family while her husband ran a Chinatown grocery store. After analyzing thousands of faces and cars every day for years, Dorothy had an extraordinary memory for faces, transactions, and she subsequently gave detectives one of the most thorough explanations of Harrison's last actions. For a number of reasons, Dorothy had a distinct memory of the transaction. First of all, the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow was a really unique and uncommon car that stood out from the regular buses, trucks, and automobiles that traverse the bridge on a daily basis. Secondly, when Harrison gave the toll money, he appeared nervous and preoccupied, fumbling with his wallet and dropping multiple bills before being able to make the right payment. The majority. Notably, she saw that Harrison was constantly checking his rearview mirror, seemingly worried about being pursued by a different car. After that, Harrison Blackwood and his the Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow appeared to have disappeared from the planet like a ship vanishing beyond human comprehension. No more sightings were discovered in spite of a thorough investigation that ultimately involved several police agencies, organizations in the Northeast, and cost the Blackwood family hundreds of thousands of dollars in search-related costs, prize money, and private investigator fees. As soon as Harrison, when he didn't come home that night, his domestic workers thought he had chosen to spend the night at his country home in the Hamptons, something he sometimes did spontaneously when he needed time alone to reflect, overcome difficult business issues, or to get away from Manhattan's social strains. Life. Therefore, domestic employees, such as his lifelong housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, and Henri Dubois, his personal chef, were used to Harrison's occasionally erratic travel schedules and did not promptly bring up the issue of his absence. But when Harrison did not show up for work the next morning and did not answer Margaret's calls, O'Sullivan, who needed to attend to a number of pressing issues, she asked Victoria Peton where he was. When Victoria discovered that she had not heard from Harrison since their fairly stressful 3 nights prior, at Lernerdan, they had a dinner talk, one of their preferred eateries in Manhattan. Harrison had been distracted during their last breakfast together and remote, picking at his food and responding to Victoria's attempts at conversation in a distracted manner. After she had questioned him directly about what was bothering him, inquiring as to whether his business was having issues or if he was stressed out about their connection, Harrison dismissed her worries and shifted the conversation to innocuous subjects like their future weekend plans and the restaurant's wine list. Now confronted with his, Victoria started to wonder that their relationship issues might be more serious than she had thought because to their enigmatic disappearance. Realized that Harrison might be dealing with a crisis in his personal or professional life. He had refused to tell her. At first, the New York Police Department handled Harrison's disappearance like any other missing person case, supposing that the affluent banker had just chosen to take an unplanned vacation without telling anyone of his goal or the length of his journey. Such actions weren't totally uncommon among the city's wealthy, who frequently possessed the means and autonomy to take impromptu trips to far-off places for work or pleasure, occasionally staying in communicado for several days or weeks at a period. The veteran detective, Robert Morrison, the case's investigator, had been with the NYPD for 22 years and had handled other instances of a similar nature involving well-known New Yorkers who had disappeared for a short while before reappearing days or weeks later with long justifications about pressing business, travel, romantic escapes, or exclusive retreats to upscale resorts or estates. Morrison had learned from his experience that affluent people frequently followed separate laws and expectations compared to regular people, and their frequent disappearances implicated complicated business or personal agreements that worried family members first misinterpreted associates and members. But when the hours stretched into days and Harrison was still unaccounted for, the investigation's tone and scope grew increasingly somber. The Blackwood family's great wealth and power guaranteed that the case received substantial funding and attention from regional law enforcement organizations. Harrison Montgomery Blackwood, Jr., the father, called the police directly, commissioner and the mayor's office to request a thorough search that makes use of all available resource and method of investigation. Private security companies were employed to enhance the official investigation by providing access to specialized knowledge in cases of missing persons and resources that government organizations did not have access to. A hefty $50,000 reward was provided in exchange for any information that would ensure Harrison's safe return. A sum, for the majority of working-class New Yorkers in 1975, that was a fortune. This produced hundreds of reports of sightings and tips from all over the nation. The hunt for Harrison Blackwood soon spread beyond the boundaries of New York City with his lost Rolls-Royce. Borders to cover the whole Northeast Corridor and eventually a large of North America. Law enforcement organizations in newly-tatted England, Eastern Canada, and the mid-Atlantic states were given thorough accounts of the man and his unique car with pictures and all the details that would allow for quick identification. Border crossings, train terminals, and airports were watched for any indication of the banker who went missing, while immigration and customs officers were informed of. Keep an eye out for Harrison's passport or any attempts to enter the nation using his identity. His bank and credit cards accounts were closely monitored to look for any unexpected transactions or suspicious activities that could offer hints concerning his location or the circumstances behind his abduction. Morrison, the detective, and his growing team started the meticulous and drawn-out task of retracing Harrison's activities in the days and weeks preceding his disappearance. They conducted interviews with numerous individuals who had communicated with him through social connections, business partners, and service personnel and casual acquaintances who may have seen odd behavior or overheard discussions that would shed light on his mental state or future plans. A complicated and unsettling image of a man who, despite his external achievement and self-assurance, having been under a lot of pressure, either personally or professionally, that even his closest pals had not been able or willing to share with him. Colleagues. The analysis found behavioral patterns that suggested, in the weeks prior to his disappearance, Harrison had been getting ready for some sort of significant transition or emergency. The investigators' financial investigation showed that Harrison had made a number of significant and extremely unusual transactions in the weeks before to his disappearance. Actions that were completely at odds with his usual systematic and conservative approach to asset management. A significant amount of his investment has been liquidated. Portfolio turning assets, bonds, and stocks valued at more than $2 million into cash and moving the money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. When asked about, Harrison's accountants and business associates were perplexed and concerned about these transactions, pointing out that from the standpoint of financial planning, the moves were illogical and indicated a significant divergence from the investment tactics that had directed the Blackwood family's wealth management for generations. The fact that these transfers took place during a time of economic turbulence and market uncertainty indicated either panic or preparing for situations that Harrison had not disclosed to his financial advisors. Maybe even more, the finding that Harrison had been getting unexplained phone calls at both his office and his apartment in the month before he vanished. Investigators were informed by Margaret O'Sullivan that there have been multiple calls from people who declined to identify themselves and persisted on talking to Harrison directly, became irate or violent when she tried to answer messages or filter calls. At least twice, Margaret had noticed that after taking such calls, Harrison's attitude drastically changed, leaving him clearly scared and, for hours later, I was preoccupied. She recounted watching him walk around his workplace, pausing occasionally to gaze out the window as though deep in contemplation or worry about things he would not talk about. These alterations in behavior were. Margaret had thought about asking Harrison directly about the calls because it was so unusual, but is clear she hadn't pursued the issue since she was distressed and respected his privacy. The investors from Europe who had spoke with Harrison the morning before he vanished were topics of special interest for the investigative group. Detective Morrison made plans to visit Switzerland in order to speak with Klaus Baer and his colleagues in an effort to learn more about their commercial connection with Harrison that could account for his later disappearance and the seeming anguish he had shown after their encounter. But Weber and his associates upheld stringent confidentiality on their conversations with the American banker, citing Swiss banking and client privacy issues, laws that prevented foreign law enforcement organizations from learning about such information. The Swiss, despite being polite and professional, the authorities refused to force their residents to give information that was shielded by their country's renownedly stringent financial privacy regulations. Through thorough interrogation and research, Morrison was able to ascertain that the European group has been looking to use Blackwood to make significant investments in American banking and real estate markets, and associates as their principal advisor and middleman for negotiating the intricate regulatory landscape that controlled foreign investment in U.S. assets. The sums at stake were massive, possibly amounting to transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars that would have produced substantial commissions and fees for Harrison's company. But Harrison seemed to be somewhat worried about the suggested arrangements, but Weber declined to provide further details, particulars of their arguments, or the causes of Harrison's hesitation to move forward with the company connection. The Swiss bankers were cautious. Diplomatic reactions, as well as his. The hush observed by acquaintances indicated that the meeting had featured more than just standard financial conversations. However, Morrison, unable to break through the barrier of professional caution that shielded the specifics of their dialogue. Weeks went by with Harrison and his car nowhere to be found. Investigators started thinking about darker scenarios that go well beyond a voluntary disappearance or a failed business trip. The global financial industry in India. The 1970s were a complicated and occasionally hazardous time when large amounts of money were transferred via networks of banks, businesses, and governmental organizations that weren't usually closely monitored or controlled by law enforcement organizations. Harrison's availability of these funds channels, in addition to the distinguished standing of his family and his personal connections with powerful people, would have made him an invaluable asset to the financial sector. Several groups, both legal and illegal, looking to transfer funds over international borders without drawing unwelcome attention from law enforcement or regulatory bodies. The inquiry enlarged to incorporate federal organizations with knowledge of financial crimes and global affairs. White-collar crime-focused FBI officers started looking for any ties to organized crime in Harrison's commercial transactions, money laundering schemes, or other illicit actions that could have put his safety in danger, or efforts to force him to participate in illegal activities. Harrison's disappearances timing, taking place during a time of considerable political unrest and economic turmoil, both domestically and generated concerns on a global scale regarding his potential involvement in schemes that finally resulted in his death. In peril, the mid-1970s were marked by currency depreciation and inflation, social unrest, governmental scandals, and instability that produced opportunities enable criminal groups to take advantage of flaws in banking systems and regulatory frameworks. Victoria Peton was seen as both a witness and a possible suspect in the case, despite her evident distress and collaboration with. Authorities gradually dispelled any significant suspicions regarding her participation in. Her close contact with Harrison had given her comprehensive knowledge about Harrison's disappearance, of his routines, worries, and recent behavioral shifts that demonstrated crucial to investigators attempting to comprehend his mental state and potential intentions. Victoria disclosed unsettling information to Detective Morrison and his crew during lengthy interrogation regarding Harrison's increasing secrecy and paranoia in the weeks before disappeared. She explained how he had started using a tiny electronic device to search his apartment for listening devices, detector that he had bought from a supplier of security equipment without telling her why such safety measures were necessary, had become essential. Harrison had also started making changes to his daily schedule. Statement implied he was worried about being observed or followed by strangers. Rather than traveling the same route to work every morning, he would choose various routes at random and occasionally even use public transportation or cabs rather than walking. He had begun making appointments at restaurants under fictitious names and demanding to be seated at tables where he could see the exits and entrances. Most importantly, Victoria revealed that Harrison had, 3 days prior to his disappearance, he had given her the key to a safety deposit box, with mysterious instructions to use it only in the event that he was harmed. The secret was accompanied by a handwritten note with the address and box number of a Midtown bank branch. Harrison kept the box in Manhattan under a fictitious identity. When, after obtaining an order to access the safety deposit box, detectives found documents that offered the first hard proof and added to the enigma surrounding Harrison's last days, that it's possible his disappearance wasn't voluntary. There were copies in a box of financial documents, communications with overseas banks, and what seemed to be proof of money laundering operations involving a number of Blackwood and Associates' biggest and most significant customers. The most unsettling was a handwritten note to Victoria that was sealed in an envelope and marked, with clear directives to open only if Harrison passes away or extend the disappearing period. The letter was signed with Harrison's signature penmanship, and his entire name offered insight into the anxieties and stresses that had been devouring him in the latter weeks of his life. Harrison conveyed in the letter his profound affection for Victoria, while admitting that he had gotten entangled in business transactions that had put both his life and reputation are in grave danger. He stated that some of his clients had been forcing him to assist with money-related transactions that he thought were unlawful, from illicit businesses using legal financial channels in order to conceal its source and make cash accessible for investing in legitimate companies. Harrison clarified that his efforts to remove himself from these connections and to decline to assist the money laundering activities going forward had led to growing dangers to his safety and the safety of those he loved. According to the letter, he had been terrified for weeks, uncertain of who he could rely on and unsure of how to defend himself without putting others in danger. The letter gave detectives their first hard proof that Harrison's disappearance was probably unintentional and potentially related to his murder. Harrison stated in his writing that he feared for his life and had been preparing backup plans in case he had to swiftly vanish in order to shield himself and others from the criminal groups that were putting pressure on him. He said, having saved money for emergencies and a secure location to hide if needed, but he offered no particulars about this refuge's location or characteristics for security purposes. The letter ended with Harrison's intense optimism that he would be able to find a solution to his issues and safely return to Victoria and his regular life, but also acknowledged the very real chance that they may never cross paths again. He requested that Victoria think of him as he had been during their most joyful moments together, and to comprehend that any choices he had taken were driven by his wish to shield her and his family from the evil people who have penetrated his professional life. Equipped with this fresh and unsettling data, the inquiry took on heightened urgency and significantly broadened scope. Federal agents started analyzing the global financial networks Harrison had referenced in his correspondence, revealing an intricate network of connections between banks, businesses, and governmental organizations from several nations that had been utilized to transfer enormous sums of money from illicit sources. The sums of money involved were enormous, perhaps signifying transactions of billions of dollars that have its origins in American financial organizations to conceal their sources and destinations. The plans included complex techniques for turning money from illegal activities like drug trafficking and the sale of weapons into legal investments in bonds, stocks, real estate, and other financial products. Things could be freely exchanged on legitimate markets. The inquiry found that Harrison had first gotten involved in these agreements through what seemed to be respectable business dealings. Connections with affluent foreign customers want to invest in American markets. But it seems that as time went on, he realized that many of these clients were really fronts for criminal groups, and his bank was a key conduit in money laundering activities that broke a number of federal regulations. Harrison's attempts to end these contacts and inform federal authorities of his fears had evidently set off a situation that eventually resulted in his disappearance and maybe murder. The offender. There was too much at stake for the groups involved to let a well-known banker, with thorough understanding of their activities, to collaborate with law enforcement or to reveal their plans to be examined by the public. The hunt for Harrison's Rolls-Royce turned into a main objective of the enlarged inquiry, with law enforcement organizations around the Northeast carrying out methodical searches of isolated locations where the unique car might have been concealed or disposed of by his murderers. Advanced search equipment-equipped helicopters flew cautiously. Grid patterns over the Adirondacks, the Catskill Mountains, and other wilderness regions that are accessible from Manhattan by car. Groups of divers scoured the area's lakes, rivers, and reservoirs for any. While ground search teams searched through forests, there was no indication of the missing car and its occupant. Properties, as well as other places where evidence may have been hidden. The large expanses made the searches difficult, that had to be covered, as well as the possibility that professional criminals would have opted for disposal or burial. Locations that were quite challenging to find. Despite all of these efforts, during the first few months of the thorough investigation, there was no sign of Harrison or his car. The situation progressively transformed into a cold case missing person investigation from an active search and rescue effort. Even so, due to the Blackwood family's substantial financial means, private investigators were able to continue working on the long after official law enforcement organizations were compelled to lessen their engagement because of other urgent cases and financial limitations. Years went by, and Harrison's mystery, Blackwood's disappearance, turned into one of the most persistent and well-known, talked about unresolved instances. Occasional sightings of Harrison and his reports of unique Rolls-Royce came from all across the world, from upscale ski areas in Switzerland to isolated, from remote South American settlements to Caribbean islands. were affluent. There were rumors that Americans were living under false pretenses. But none of these observations were ever verified by trustworthy witness testimony or verifiable proof, and several seem to be instances of misidentification or wishful thinking by people who had been enthralled with the case through widespread media attention. The narrative had drawn widespread attention, imagination in part because to its dramatic components, the affluent banker, the opulent vehicle, and the enigmatic disappearance that appeared to belong more to fiction as opposed to reality. The Blackwood family never gave up trying to figure out what happened to Harrison, refusing to acknowledge his death in the absence of solid evidence and upholding hope that he could be discovered alive at some point, possibly with amnesia or being detained in an isolated place against his will. Harrison's dad employed a series of over the years, private investigators have contributed many hypotheses and methods to the case while drinking significant sums of the family's resources without yielding conclusive outcomes. Some researchers concentrated on the global financial ties, thinking that criminal groups had killed Harrison, attempting to shield their money laundering activities from public scrutiny. These hypotheses prompted research in numerous nations and intensive monitoring of anyone thought to be involved in global financial crimes. However, no hard proof has been found that may result in prosecutions or arrests. According to the theories of other investigators, Harrison had willingly vanished to avoid being prosecuted for his role in illicit financial schemes and was residing in a nation lacking extradition agreements with the United States under a false name. This hypothesis was backed by Harrison's significant cash withdrawals and transfers from offshore accounts before he vanished, as well as his seeming readiness for a possible emergency evacuation. Catherine Blackwood, Harrison's mother, clung to the hope that her son was still living someplace, possibly with accident-related amnesia or trauma or being detained against his will by unidentified captors for a purpose to conceal him while keeping him alive. She took care of his penthouse, precisely way he had left it, covering the utilities and rent for decades while awaiting his return, and prohibiting anyone from interfering with his personal property or making any changes to the area he had lived in. The omission of the Rolls-Royce from the everyday, the parking garage of the skyscraper reminded Catherine of her son's enigmatic fate, yet she persisted. Hope that Harrison and his cherished vehicle will one day return to restore her family to wholeness. Over the years, she provided funding for multiple searches and probes consistently, wishing that the next endeavor would be the one that brought her kid home at last. Over the years, Harrison's financial environment saw significant change. After his disappearance, with adjustments that could have avoided the events that had reportedly resulted in his demise, the rules governing international banking, which had been comparatively lax and ill-coordinated in the 1970s, were progressively tightened in reaction to mounting financial problems, money laundering, financing terrorism, and other illicit activities involving the world financial system. During Harrison's time, a large number of the offshore financial havens that had enabled dubious transactions were compelled to enact more stringent reporting guidelines and openness initiatives that made it much more. It is challenging for criminal groups to transfer funds through reputable financial systems covertly. The bank. Federal laws, such as the Secrecy Act, established new standards for financial firms to keep an eye on and disclose questionable transactions, while global financial cooperation. New treaties and information sharing agreements significantly improved criminal investigations. After 35 years, Detective Morrison left the New York Police Department in 1992. Despite his years of service, he continued to ponder about the Blackwood case, which had become somewhat of an obsession for him throughout his last years as an officer. When he was retired, he sometimes examined the documents, pursued fresh leads that surfaced over time, and kept in touch with federal investigators and private investigators who kept working on different facets of the situation. Morrison continued to believe that Harrison had been killed by those associated with the international financial plans detailed in the letter to Victoria Peton, as well as the fact that the body of the banker and were concealed in one of upstate New York's wilderness zones, or perhaps much further out from Manhattan than the initial search operations had taken into account. He drove much. During his retirement years, he traveled through the Catskill Mountains, pausing to inspect isolated locations and deserted properties where evidence may have been hidden decades ago. Morrison's hypothesis turned out to be rather. Tommy Rodriguez's excavator smashed through the forest floor on that. On a clear October morning in 2025, the first sight of corroded metal that had been concealed for precisely 50 years underground. As a detective, the meticulous and laborious procedure of completely revealing the buried was started by Sarah Chun and her crime scene team. Rolls-Royce, everyone involved in the research realized how significant the discovery was. This was not just an abandoned car or the aftermath of an event that had been neglected for decades. This was possibly the solution to one of the most well-known missing person cases in New York history. An instance that had used a lot of resources and garnered public interest for 50 years. Without a conclusion, the necessary excavating procedure, exceptional attention to detail, with each shovel full of dirt, perhaps holding important evidence that had been maintained by the special setting that the car's burial provided. Under Detective Chin's direction, the crime scene team worked meticulously, taking pictures and recording every phase of the dig while looking for any evidence of human remains or other hints that could help explain Harrison Blackwood's fate half a century ago. The dirt surrounding the vehicle revealed unmistakable proof of intentional burial and excavation as opposed to gradual buildup. The outfit, depth of roughly 6 feet, the vehicle's cautious placement, and the methodical backfilling of the excavation location all showed that expert machinery and knowledgeable operators had participated in the evidence's concealment. The seclusion of the area, more only reachable by trekking routes and more over 2 miles from the closest road, showed that the person who had selected this isolated burial location had given it significant thought. Since, as more of the Rolls-Royce came out of its earth burial, details that verified beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Harrison's missing car. Doubt. The characteristic British racing green paint, although being severely harmed by, was still identifiable in places where protective primers and sealers had stopped it after decades of burial. Total decline. Despite being rusted, the wire spoke wheels partially gave way beneath the weight, because soil and time maintained their distinctive pattern and spoke configuration. In the end, the car identification number, once fully revealed and meticulously cleaned by forensic experts, precisely matching Harrison's insurance records, business, registration paperwork, and the thorough descriptions that had been sent to law police across the nation during the initial inquiry. Without a question, this was Harrison Blackwood's Silver Shadow Rolls-Royce. At last, after a century of hiding, the location and state of the vehicle revealed more details about the conditions surrounding its interment. It looked like the car was driven or moved to the location before, properly placed in the pit that had been dug, then covered with dirt and forest debris. The comparatively good preservation of the passenger compartment, shielded by the car's sturdy design and sealed windows, had produced a setting in which records and organic materials might have survived decades of interment. The damage to the driver's door appeared to be gunshot holes, indicating that violence had happened at or close to the car. The damage's location and pattern were consistent with gunfire fired in the direction of the driver from outside the vehicle, bolstering theories that Harrison had not merely vanished willingly or died, but had been murdered. In a mishap, investigators discovered inside the car evidence that would fundamentally change how they interpret Harrison Blackwood's disappearance and offer responses to queries that had plagued his family and investigators for half a century. Even yet, the leather seats diminished over time due to moisture, yet they still had some of their original tan. color, and fundamental structural soundness. Above all, the interior of the vehicle included human remains that were instantly identifiable as those of an adult guy of Harrison's approximate age and physical attributes. The skeletal remains were meticulously taken out of the car and brought to the state forensics lab for in-depth examination and identification, while the car was taken to a safe location where each surface might be inspected for more proof. The forensic analysis of the corpses discovered in what many investigators have long believed but were never able to verify was confirmed by Rolls-Royce. Montgomery, Harrison, Blackwood, 3 had been killed. The skeletal remains provided unmistakable proof. Severe trauma consistent with numerous gunshot wounds, suggesting that the well-known financier had previously died. His remains and car were delivered to this isolated Catskill burial location. Mountains. Forensic experts were able to preserve evidence in the sealed environment of the buried car, with considerably more hints than, after all these years, they had dared to hope for. Remnants of Harrison's clothes, leather fragments from his shoes, briefcase, and even tiny metal items like his cuff links and watch were found inside the car. Most importantly, advanced DNA analysis methods that weren't available during the initial investigation were unquestionably that Harrison Montgomery Blackwood 3's remains were, in fact, present. DNA samples from teeth and bone were matched with genetic material from Harrison's surviving family members, offering scientific assurance that the E50 year. At last, the puzzle had been resolved. According to the forensic findings, Harrison was shot many times at close range in what seemed more like an execution-style murder than a robbery, mishap, or arbitrary criminal activity. The state and location of the remnants showed that Harrison had been slain somewhere else and that his corpse and car had been taken to the grave, most likely a day or two after he vanished, in order to reduce the possibility of being found. More proof was discovered. Personal belongings that had been preserved by the buried environment and the car's protective framework. Despite being ruined by rain and chemical changes in the soil, Harrison's wallet still held his credit cards, driver's licenses, and family photos that could be recognized with meticulous laboratory analysis. More importantly, detectives found Harrison's briefcase trapped underneath the driver's seat, perhaps by Harrison himself, or by his murderers when he was being buried. The briefcase is made of superior calfskin and outfitted with corrosion-resistant metal fittings, held documents that offered fresh perspectives on the intricate money laundering methods that seems to have cost Harrison his life. These contact with foreign banks, thorough documentation of questionable financial operations, and Harrison's own handwritten notes revealing his increasing awareness of the business's illegality. He had been asked to assist with plans. The documents gave a precise chronology of Harrison's discovery of the money laundering scheme and his fruitless attempts to distance himself from the illegal plot. The most significant item in the suitcase was a thorough note that Harrison had reportedly produced for federal law enforcement organizations outlining the money laundering methods and identifying the main players within the illegal conspiracy. It was obvious that the document was meant to insulate Harrison from revenge by giving authorities sufficient material to bring charges against the criminals in the event that he was harmed. Harrison's remains were found, and the financial and social communities of New York were rocked by his buried Rolls-Royce, and many people who were still alive and able to see the outcome if they had known Harrison or had followed his case over the years. One of the biggest mysteries in the city. Local and national news dominated. Weeks of national media coverage, including in-depth retrospective pieces analyzing the first inquiry and the 1970s social and economic environment. A large crowd assembled to lament his death, while rejoicing that his family will at last find answers to the concerns that had plagued them for half a century. 78-year-old Victoria Peton, and she had been married to a different guy for a long time and had raised 3 children with him, attended a memorial service that the Blackwood family arranged in order to properly lay Harrison's memory to rest. honor, and ritual. Victoria discussed the young man during the memorial service. She described Harrison as someone who had both enormous privilege and a true affection, wished to make responsible use of his position. She observed that his final destiny was to die, because he had made an effort to uphold morality in the face of criminal pressure. Bravery that had initially drawn her to him. The inquiry into the finding of Harrison's corpse and the evidence in his buried automobile increased the urgency of his murder. Although the 50-year lapse between the crime and its resolution presented serious obstacles for prosecutors seeking to file charges against the perpetrators, Detective Chun and her group working in the difficult job of reconstructing the events started with collaboration with federal investigators and prosecutors that had caused Harrison's demise 50 years prior. The records located in Harrison's bag offered vital information on the global financial plot that had eventually cost him his life, pointing out banks, businesses, and people who had been implicated in money laundering from illicit activities. But as time went on, the majority of the initial participants, either naturally or as a result of their personal participation in illegal acts that led to incarceration or death. The data indicated that Harrison had been murdered by people involved in an advanced money laundering scheme that had exploited Blackwood and Associates and other esteemed banking organizations to transfer enormous quantities of money from criminal businesses into reputable financial markets. Harrison's efforts to retreat from these arrangements, driven by his moral opposition to them and his increasing understanding of their illegality. It appears that the criminal had considered aiding criminal activity to be an intolerable threat. Organizations that are involved. Federal investigators were able to pinpoint a number of significant individuals in the money laundering scheme using the records discovered in Harrison's briefcase and by contrasting them with financial documents that were kept in several government archives. But in the decades since Harrison's death, the majority of these people had passed away from natural causes, while some had either vanished into witness protection programs or been killed in gang conflicts. In the relatively uncontrolled financial climate of the 1970s, the probe did uncover ties to foreign financial organizations, corrupt government officials, and organized criminal families. The money laundering operation, which involved billions of dollars in networks spanning parts of Asia, Europe, and North America, was significantly larger and more sophisticated than investigators had initially thought. Harrison's body and car were buried in a secluded area, which offered more information about his murderer's tactics. The burial site was situated on land that had formerly belonged to a construction company in the New York metropolitan area that had ties to organized criminal gangs. The company's genuine construction operations in the region would have given ideal cover for the burial operation, and heavy equipment from this company would have been easily accessible to dig the deep hole needed to bury the Rolls-Royce. Investigators also learned that immediately after Harrison's disappearance in late October 1975, a number of construction firm employees had reported odd nocturnal activity in the Woodland region. Following the discovery of Harrison's burial place and the evidence it contained, these reports, which had previously been written off as standard equipment maintenance or security patrols, took on new significance. According to the investigation, skilled criminals with a great deal of expertise disposing of bodies and evidence covertly had meticulously planned and carried out Harrison's murder. The decision to bury Harrison in his unique Rolls-Royce suggested both pragmatic and symbolic reasons that demonstrated the killer's skill and their wish to make a statement to others who might think about betraying the organization's interests. Practically speaking, the burial removed two pieces of evidence that would have helped detectives identify the murderers. Harrison's unique car, which might have been tracked using a variety of techniques to provide information about his last movements and the circumstances of his death, and his body, which would have held forensic evidence connecting him to his killers. Harrison's fancy car was buried as a symbol of what would happen to anyone who may think about compromising the criminal organization's interests. Harrison's riches, social standing, and status were symbolized by the Rolls-Royce, all of which had failed to shield him from the fallout from his moral choice to oppose illegal activity. Despite the abundance of fresh evidence found with Harrison's remains, the investigation encountered considerable obstacles while attempting to prosecute him for his murder. The majority of the important people identified by the bank records and other evidence had passed away in the 50 years since the crime was committed, and the few people who were still alive who might have known about the murder were old and claimed to have no recall of what had happened so long ago. For the majority of possible charges pertaining to the money laundering conspiracy that resulted in Harrison's murder, the statute of limitations has long ago passed. But according to New York law, murder charges never expire, and police are still looking for any information that could lead to Harrison's killers being prosecuted, even though it is improbable that they will succeed after such a long time. Federal detectives who had spent decades looking into the international financial crimes Harrison had wandered into during his last weeks also found closure in the discovery. The case turned into a useful study on the development of money laundering methods and the significance of international collaboration. Harrison had not willingly vanished to begin a new life in a far-off place. He had been brutally killed for attempting to uphold moral principles in the face of criminal pressure to enable illicit financial activities. In the end, his moral fortitude and integrity had cost him his life. However, his family took solace in the fact that he had died, defending the integrity of his institution and his reputation rather than giving in to criminal pressure or voluntarily engaging in illicit activities. Harrison had been willing to assist law authorities in exposing the money laundering enterprise, as evidenced by the documents discovered in his briefcase, even being aware that this kind of cooperation could endanger his life. At a news conference after the finding, Harrison's nephew, Harrison Montgomery Blackwood Thor, who was named after his lost uncle and was now a prosperous investment banker, spoke on behalf of the family. He said that although the family was relieved to get answers at last, they were However, the case also struck a chord with the public because it showed the perils faced by those who try to oppose powerful criminal organizations, and because it showed that justice could eventually triumph over those who thought they could kill people without consequence, even if it took some time. The narrative gave relatives of victims in other unresolved cases hope by demonstrating how advancements in forensic science and investigative methods might revitalize even the most ancient cold cases. The case was used by law enforcement organizations across the nation to demonstrate how developments in forensic science and investigation methods had allowed for the extraction of significant evidence from a crime scene that had been concealed for 50 years. The preservation of bank records, DNA evidence, and other materials within the buried car showed how contemporary forensic techniques could resolve cases that had appeared hopeless with the technology available at the time the crimes were committed. The Blackwood case was incorporated into the curricula of educational institutions and law enforcement training programs as a study on the development of financial crime investigation and the significance of perseverance in cold case investigations. The case showed how criminal plots might go unnoticed for decades before being discovered thanks to developments in forensic science and investigative methods that weren't available at the time the crimes were committed. The case also demonstrated the value of keeping thorough records and preserving evidence, since papers from 50 years ago were essential to comprehending the events surrounding Harrison's murder and the intricate criminal plot that resulted in his demise. The thorough documentation produced by the initial investigators served as the basis for the contemporary forensic analysis that ultimately resolved the case. The excavator operator who had made the first find, Tommy Rodriguez, was suddenly forced into the public eye when media outlets wanted to speak with the man whose everyday labor had unraveled one of New York's biggest mysteries. Rodriguez, a modest laborer who had just been carrying out his duties when he discovered the buried Rolls-Royce, was taken aback by the publicity, but as she prepared her final report on the investigation, Detective Sarah Chun thought back on the case and noted the odd coincidence that her grandmother, Dorothy, had been the last person to see Harrison Blackwood alive, and that she had been the detective who ultimately found out what had happened to him. The relationship between her family's 2 generations and the Blackwood case appeared to symbolize the lengthy legal journey that, after 50 years of enigma and conjecture, had finally come to an end. In her report, Chun stated that while the finding of Harrison's remains had answered concerns that had plagued detectives for 50 years, it had also sparked fresh inquiries about probable victims of the same criminal group. According to the records discovered in Harrison's briefcase, the money laundering operation may have involved hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit transactions, as well as dozens of other financial institutions. 1 year after the discovery, Detective Chun paid one last visit to the gravesite where Harrison Blackwood's Rolls-Royce was discovered as autumn returned to the Catskill Mountains. New trees were planted to replace the ones that had been lost during the excavation, returning the area to its original form. The site where one of New York's greatest mysteries had finally been unraveled was only marked by a modest memorial plaque. As Chun stood in the serene E.T. forest, he thought about how the Blackwood family and a whole generation of investigators who had spent decades working on the case had found closure thanks to the finding. As a time capsule, the buried Rolls-Royce preserved memories and evidence from a bygone age as it waited for contemporary forensic science to unlock its mysteries and uncover Harrison Blackwood's true fate.